Well, hello, my name is Trey Lovern, and I'm here with my wife, Melody.
Hello.
Welcome to the White Ribbon Against Pornography Week webinar series sponsored by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation works to address the public health crisis of pornography in addition to exposing the links between all forms of sexual exploitation. The center is a national sponsor of White Ribbon Against Pornography Week, which is an annual national week of public awareness and education about the harms of pornography. To learn more, you can go to their website at EndSexualExploitation. Well, again, my name is Trey Lovern, and here with my wife, Melody, we are privileged to be a part of this wrap week with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Our particular webinar this morning that you're tuning into is entitled Out of Isolation, the Role of Healing Community in the Battle Against Pornography. Now, this is something that is really, really close to Melody and I. We, as we're going to share a little bit of where we have been and how pornography has impacted our lives. But we are based in Birmingham, Alabama, have a ministry organization here in Birmingham called Undone Redone. And we do have a resource at undoneredone.com/wrap. It is a free download. It's a chapter that I wrote that's related to this topic on community. For our friends at Covenant Eyes, a chapter that's a free download for their book that they wrote, that I wrote for them. And we want you that access so that you can go and get our understanding beyond this on community, of how community is vitally important to the healing process. So in Undone Redone, we make a difference in three areas as it relates to pornography and sexual brokenness. The first is prevention and protection. And we do that with an initiative called My Secure Family. I was exposed to pornography when I was 8 years old. And so today's 8-year-old, I know, is exposed to things that are much different than what I was exposed to. But I know the impact that the magazines had on me. Today's 8-year-old is for hardcore, very violent, graphic video pornography that they're exposed to. So through My Secure Family, we work with parents on the side of prevention. And then we also have Recovery and Restoration, our initiative that's called Route 1520, where we work with men who are struggling significantly with sexual brokenness, pornography, other types of sexual brokenness. But also, Melody does a tremendous job on the spouse's side, the betrayal trauma that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a bit. And then finally, we have an initiative that focuses on justice and anti-exploitation called Every Click Enslaves. And this is where kind of the double meaning there, every click enslaves those who are clicking and the enslavement to pornography addiction, but also, as we know so well from our friends at the National Center, and they're being able to educate all of us on the tie, the critical tie between pornography and sex trafficking. And so Click Enslaves, we work to bring justice and also opportunities on the anti-exploitation.
So the reason why we are uniquely qualified to talk about this topic today is that our kids, basically in year 2000, our kids were 6, 5, 4, and 2 years old. Trey's and my story, basically his struggle with pornography and sexual addiction blew up our family. And this initially led to us being divorced for 6 years, and nothing really prepares you for being blindsided by betrayal. And Trey's going to talk a little bit more about his struggle with pornography and what allowed that for us to come together with that as well.
But we did, after 6 years of divorce, we were reconciled and our family came back together. Our kids did grow up. Yep. This was a recent shot of our family. And so we're grateful for the restoration that's been brought about in our own family. But it was the community, what we're talking about this morning, was the missing element in our own recovery process. And just a real quick quote that I wanted to share. This is from a writer for the Huffington Post, Chris Rowan. He says, technology's impact on the 21st century family is fracturing its very foundation and causing a disintegration of core values that long ago were the fabric that held families together. And one of the values, though, of our ministry, and I know that National Center on Sexual Exploitation certainly shares this, is not to avoid and do away with all technology, but certainly to redeem technology. Even today, we're able to do that through this webinar, being able to leverage technology to bring this important information to a broader audience. But let's look at some of the stats related to pornography. As Melody mentioned, and I had shared earlier, I was 8 years old when I was exposed to pornography, and the impact I know it had on me, but it brought about a lot of hiding. But just looking at where things are now, and a lot of this is based, many of you probably have seen this, the recent publication by the Barna organization called The Porn Phenomenon. We finally have very current statistics based on their research, their very thorough research, as far as what we're dealing with when it comes to pornography. I just want to kind of cover a few of these. First of all, 1 out of 3 Americans seek porn at least once per month. So many times, often still, people talk about this as just being a guy's issue. It's certainly not. It is impacting both men and women. Another stat, 4 out of 10 young adult males in the church seek porn once or twice per month. 4 out of 10.
And 90% of teens and 96% of young adults are either encouraging, accepting, or neutral when they talk about porn with their friends.
So certainly it's having an impact on the way we think about sex and sexuality. We certainly can refer to our culture now as a pornified culture, I think pretty accurately, with just the way this is seeping into all arenas and beginning to greatly impact the way we view sex and sexuality. 62% of U.S. teens and young adults have received a text with a nude image. And this is where we're really working as a ministry to help this change. But only now, 7% of pastors say their church has a ministry program for those struggling with pornography. And this is one of the big things that as a ministry we're trying to come alongside churches and ministry organizations to help them begin to address this epidemic that is crippling so many and certainly destroying families. But one of the things, concept we want to talk about is a thing called shame. Now, when I was struggling all those years in secret and silence with my own addiction, I didn't know to call what I was feeling shame. I now know very accurately what that feels like, but it was just kind of this internal ache of my soul. But I want to bring up shame because we've got to understand in battling pornography, we've got to understand what fuels the addiction. And certainly shame is the fuel that drives addiction. And the reason this is important is because so often what happens when we're combating and battling pornography, especially if you're in a faith-based organization, historically this has been true, we think logically, if we're one who doesn't struggle with addiction, if we will just make people feel bad enough about what they're doing, if we'll remind them enough about how harmful it is to them, how harmful it is to other people, of how it may be wrecking their life, then they're going to make the logical decision to stop doing it. But that is bringing to addiction this whole idea of logic. And so when it comes to addiction, as we know from both not just pornography addiction, but certainly drugs and alcohol as well. The thing about addiction that the brain science, and again, Nikosi has done such a great job of educating us on a lot of this with the brain science, but the actual frontal lobe, the frontal cortex of our brain actually begins to shut down, and as the dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin floods the brain. So to try to bring logic to the one who is addicted, when the frontal lobe has shut down, it really defies logic. And certainly if you've been in relationship or been involved at any level with someone who struggles with any addiction, you certainly have seen that firsthand. So we need to understand this concept of shame. And when we talk about shame, I turn to an author, Brene Brown. She is a very well-known best-selling author. And it's interesting how popular she is, but her platform is vulnerability and shame. And I think there's something in our culture that is resonating with what Brene Brown is writing and many others as it relates to this topic of shame. But I want to use her definition for this webinar for shame. She says, shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. I can certainly remember those feelings because growing up in a faith-based home, it very much a lot of emphasis on outward behavior. Well, I knew the behavior was wrong, even at an early age. But knowing it was wrong, unfortunately, was not translating into making better choices and changing the behavior. And so the shame that I felt was there's something fundamentally wrong with me, because otherwise I would be able to kick this habit and move on toward healthy choices and not continue to go back to something that I know to be wrong. Another quote from Brene Brown.
Well, the other thing that we mention a lot in the people that we're walking with is that shame only grows in secrecy, isolation, and silence. And so we continue to feed the addiction and feed pornography and the things that keep us isolated and living in secret when we don't have something to dispel that. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit.
So here's another quote from Brene Brown. Shame erodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. Mm-hmm. And so just think about that as someone who's feeling that. Naturally, if they believe that they're incapable of change, naturally there's going to be some isolation, withdrawal, and basically, withdrawing from this. Another quote, and this was certainly a big part of our story, this idea of perfectionism. Where perfectionism exists, shame is always lurking. Mm-hmm. And then, just as Melody mentioned, shame loves secrecy. In our healing communities that we have with our Route 1520 initiative, we say often in those communities that we are only as sick as our secrets. Mm-hmm. And so with that, as we are dealing with secrecy, we've got to have a safe place where men and women can begin to come out of that, so that this is not true, but certainly when we're in the throes of shame, it is. As Brene Brown says, shame is the swampland of the soul. And so just get this picture of people in this swampland, in this place. They're stuck, but because of the feelings of inadequacy, the feelings of not measuring up, they don't feel safe to go and tell anybody else about it. What I was very guilty of doing is I would compare what I knew to be true about myself, what I believed to be true about myself, I would compare that with everyone else's highlight reel. You had it all together, I didn't, but I had to strive to make you believe, based on the mask that I was wearing, that I was worthy of love, but deep down I didn't believe that. Mm-hmm. Shame cannot survive being spoken and being met with empathy. So all these things are true about shame, but we've got to have a place now where these healing components can begin to take place. And that's where the healing community comes in. Shame does little but drive people into hiding, where it festers and grows in isolation from community and accountability. So all that about shame to lay the foundation of why community is so vitally important when it comes to battling this particular addiction. Because if we spend our energy and time trying to beat people up about bad behavior, or trying to make them feel bad about what they're doing, or try to give them some logical understanding of how detrimental their behavior is to themselves and others, we've got to understand all that is doing is causing a compounding of the problem. It's kind of like pouring gas on a fire that's already burning. We're adding more shame, which again, as we've already said, shame is the fuel that drives addiction. And so we've got to get away from shame-based tactics when it comes to dealing with the problem of pornography and other forms of sexual struggle. Because if we do that, because if we don't struggle, it makes a lot of sense to do that, because we're trying to change the behavior, but we've got to come up with more healthy alternatives than the shame-based tactics that have happened for many times in the past. So talking from the struggler standpoint, who is, so I think to understand how to bring hope and healing to people who are in the throes of the addiction, we've got to kind of walk a mile in their shoes a little bit. And so I'm going to assume that most of the people on this webinar probably are not a struggler to the point that you would say, I am a sex addict. So I think it's important for you to begin to understand, though, the mind of an addict and those core beliefs of an addict. So when I was in the throes of my addiction, my core belief, and hundreds of men that I've had the privilege of walking with since confirm this. We do also a 4-day intensive called Embark, and we're getting into changing these core beliefs. But every man who comes have some variation of the lie. If you knew me, you wouldn't love or accept me. Therefore, I must hide. And so what we're dealing with clinically when it comes to sexual addiction is an intimacy disorder. An intimacy disorder cannot be cured in isolation. And so, as we said, when that's their mindset, and they already believe that people, if they knew me, they wouldn't love me. When we tell them how bad it is, it's like pouring gas on a fire. It's only adding more shame. And I'm going to get through a few of these, because we obviously, most of our audiences are usually more from a faith-based perspective, and so the practical theology for many people, what they believe about themselves and God, is that God loves me when I do good, but He's very disappointed and even angry maybe when I do bad. Therefore, I've got to continue to perform at a high level so that He will accept me and love me again. So this one, as we get into healing community, healing and lasting change comes from community. There is no other way around that. An intimacy disorder cannot be healed in isolation. For many, many years, 20-something years, I was struggling in secret. One, I believed I was the only one struggling. Certainly in the tradition that I grew up in, I was the only man struggling. Because usually in the context where I grew up, if bad behavior was ever discussed, it was way, way, way in the past. Well, I had a current struggle, a current, very, very specific struggle that I was trying to battle on my own, because in my mind, nobody can know. I've got to continue to battle this by myself so that eventually, hopefully, I can overcome this and nobody will ever have to know the difference. When Melody and I were dating, I thought marriage was going to heal it and fix it. So I said, one, I was too cowardly to tell her what I was dealing with, because I knew she loved who she thought I was. I was not so sure that she would love who I really was. And so I never told her about my struggle before we got married. When marriage did not fix the struggle, when having natural sexual relations in the confines of marriage didn't fix it, that only compounded my shame. The core belief was, wow, I really am messed up. I really am flawed, because even marital sex is not fixing the problem with pornography. It only confirmed what I already believed to be true about myself. And so I went underground desperately trying to fix this, but I was also terrified of someone else knowing. And so for those reasons, I stayed away from healing community for a number of years, because I was trying to find anything and everything that I could do to change the behavior without anyone having to know.
So we want to talk about a spouse that has discovered betrayal by their partner. And if we look at just the word trauma, we think about a life-threatening situation. And so let's look real quickly at what just the definition of the word trauma is before we actually take a look under the hood of what betrayal trauma is. The definition of the word trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, from the Greek word meaning to wound or to pierce. And so before we even look at that, I want you to think about soldiers who have gone to combat. We know that when a soldier goes off to combat, they are prepared physically. They've gone through a boot camp. They're prepared environmentally by knowing what the conditions are where they're going. They're prepared mentally, and they're also prepared technically. And so often a soldier will go off to war and experience combat, but we know that they come back with PTSD, and they have been prepared on every level. So let's look real quickly at what betrayal trauma is, and we can see the differences of what a woman who has experienced betrayal by the person who is supposed to be safest for her. But the actual definition of the word betrayal trauma refers to the damage that is caused when someone experiences a betrayal in their primary relationship that damages the trust, safety, and security of the bond they have with their partner. So we have this bond within the context of a covenant relationship with one another, and we are married, and we experience raising children together, having children together. And so what allows me to do a lot within this interdependent relationship, within the context of a covenant marriage, is I can take risks. I can do things that are daring. I can improve in my work environment, all somewhat because I know that I've got this trust, this bond with this other person, and that at the end of the day, even if the world out there might be scary, I might experience some trauma, I know that I can run home to this person who has my back, who's supposed to be the safest for me. So what happens many times is, we talked about this soldier who goes off to combat, who is prepared on every level. A woman that has experienced betrayal is not prepared. And so how much more do we need to pay attention to the potential post-traumatic stress symptoms that she might be experiencing? So let's look at what some of these symptoms are. We know that she can experience sleeplessness, intrusive, upsetting memories of the event, flashbacks, nightmares, feelings of intense distress when reminded of the trauma, intense physical reactions to reminders of the event, avoiding activities, places, thoughts, or feelings that remind you of the trauma, inability to remember, loss of interest in activities in life in general, feeling detached from others and emotionally numb, difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outburst of anger, difficulty falling or staying asleep, difficulty concentrating, irritability or outburst of anger, hypervigilance, feeling jumpy and easily startled, paranoia, and anxiety. And some of these other things that are characterized by betrayal trauma is many times you'll hear women say things like, I feel like I've been blindsided, or hit over the head by a 2x4. I feel like I'm bleeding out. And so I want you to think about what some of these descriptions that we're actually getting from women that we walk with who've experienced this, because they don't know in this moment who is safe, what is safe, and yet they've experienced this life traumatic instance or experience, and yet they can't come home to their partner who is safe. So the really, really important thing is to find safety, to find support, and to find healing community. And we talked a few minutes ago about how shame hits somebody that is struggling. Shame also hits a spouse really, really hard, in that many times she begins to think, okay, somehow it might be my fault. And if she can begin to think that it might be her fault, then she might begin to fix this. Trey also mentioned what sometimes happens when she does finally get the courage to talk to somebody about this and they don't respond, like we normally train people to respond.
Yeah, it's very important to realize these symptoms that a woman can be going through who's experienced the trauma of betrayal. When an addict is in full-blown addict mode, there's often manipulation, there's often cover-up, there's often lying. The addict has, historically can make people around him or her feel very, very crazy. And so when a betrayed spouse may be exhibiting some of these symptoms, and let's say she has got the courage to talk to somebody, a friend or a ministry leader, or someone that could maybe begin to assess what's going on. If they don't understand some of the symptoms that she might be experiencing, from the outside looking in, she might look crazy. She might look like she's out of control in some areas, because any number of these things on this list of symptoms can be pretty unsettling. And so if the struggler who is in full-blown addiction mode, if he is just kind of sitting kind of smug idly by and just kind of letting her implode in a sense, or letting all these symptoms kind of be on display, then often we've even seen situations where maybe ministry leaders are siding with the addict, the one who has caused the betrayal. And so it can kind of be a double whammy for the woman who is experiencing the trauma, because now not only is she traumatized in this close relationship with the one who's supposed to be closest to her, now when she does have the courage to reach out for help, she's also getting blindsided there. So all the reason that healthy community is so important for her as well, to find a place where her feelings can be validated, to find a place where others are speaking the same language, even helping her to understand what she's going through, what she's feeling, why she's feeling it, because certainly most likely she's not going to be thinking this is post-traumatic stress like symptoms. She's feeling crazy, maybe she's not knowing why she's so irritable, she doesn't know why she can't sleep, and so on and so forth. So someone just beginning to educate her and normalize what she's going through can really be a stabilizing factor in her getting the ultimate help that she needs.
So just really to summarize, betrayal in a relationship, in the context of a relationship, is a trauma, and it's very real. We know that she's going to be struggling with shame, and we really want to bring her into healing community. So when she begins to ask questions like, why did I see this coming, or what did I do to deserve this, she now has other women that she can walk with in support to not only begin the process of healing, but to also begin to have some safe community, so that she's got a space to begin to really work through some of these really devastating emotions.
So when it comes to healing community, as I mentioned, I avoided that at all costs, because again, understanding now the shame that I was dealing with, I was trying to fix me with something that did not require someone else to know. But what I have found in the men that I get to do life with now is true healing in that. There's a passage in Scripture, James 5, that says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. And I was longing for the healing, but I was trying to find the healing in my aloneness and in my isolation. Give me a workbook, give me a book, and there's some great resources out there. Certainly love those things, but there's nothing that can take the place for a struggler than to step into a room where he is not alone, where other people can validate what he's been through, what he's feeling. Because our fear is, again, if you know me, you're going to be running for the exits. If you know who I really am, if you know anything about my story and the behavior that I continually struggle with, you're going to want to write me off very quickly. And so when we create a space, though, where not only is that not happening, just the opposite is happening. That people are they're taking off their mask that they've hid behind for years and actually presenting themselves and all that vulnerability that requires. This is me. And they put themselves out there vulnerably, and instead of people running for the exits, they actually experience the incredible experience of men coming toward them or women coming toward them, and even sometimes, and most of the time, saying, me too.
Right.
I relate. I thought I was the only one. Because what happens so often when we're not sharing our stories with vulnerability, we can then conclude, I must be the only one because I don't hear anybody else talking about this. That's certainly what I thought about for so many years.
Yeah, and I would say that probably one of the themes or one of the ongoing comments that we hear is, it was good to know that I wasn't alone anymore. And so that whole purpose of community is not only having the support that we need for one another, but it is to counter some of the lies that come when we are living in isolation and alone in silence and secrecy, and then being able to step into community with one another to hear the truths, to provide the safety and the support within the context of community to really begin to heal. And that's been powerful.
Because the thing about the shame, when you're alone with your own thoughts, and those thoughts are basically lies. What I believed about myself for most of my life, those core beliefs were lies. They simply were not true, but it was my truth, and it was the only truth that I knew. What healing community provides is now truth outside of us, and where we can share, this is who I am, and now I can begin to hear truth and hear perspective from other men who love me. The download that I mentioned earlier, that's free for you if you want to read further about this and our perspective as it comes to community and how that relates to accountability. The chapter that I wrote for Covenant Eyes was called Beyond the Checklist. Casting a new vision for real accountability. We believe in accountability. When it comes to men's ministry or men in general, oftentimes we're talking in terms of accountability, and it is vitally important. The problem, I think, historically has been for men's ministry or any type of men's groups is we often try to do accountability before we have community. Before I know someone loves me and they've heard my story and they're coming toward me, once I know that they're in the trenches with me, now the accountability doesn't come across as moral policing, because when we're trying to hold each other accountable, when there's not the foundation of community and being known, then it often does resort to simply just trying to police outward behavior. But when we truly establish the healing community and we know that we love each other at a deep level, we're connecting at a heart level, now we are free to hold each other accountable, but it's not in any type of slap your hand or punitive type thing. It's because I love my brother too much to allow him to settle for the small story, to settle for maybe the damaging behavior that he's engaged in, that I'm speaking truth into his life, and I'm urging him, as I'm urging myself, to step toward the bigger story that is full of adventure and wonder. So that's the importance of having that safe place where we can be known. But it's like, maybe you're hearing this, it's like, okay, how do we create that? How do we do that? One, just making sure whatever you're doing is we're not trying to do it with shame-based tactics. Telling people how bad the problem is does not work. But creating a place where those who are struggling can find community, where they can create this Me Too environment and they can be known, because that's what heals the intimacy disorder. We long to be known at our core being, our core heart level. And that's what we provide with these healing communities. So if you are looking to do this, one, I just want to give you one resource that we have, our Embark Men's Recovery Intensive. There's many great intensives around the country, but Embark, what we provide here in Alabama, is a 4-day deep dive into this type of community, where men are able to go into the root issues that are driving behavior. And also with the spouse. If you are a spouse who have experienced some of the symptoms that Melody spoke to earlier, maybe it's the first time you've ever heard the word, maybe betrayal trauma. Melody has a course called Life Beyond Betrayal that she wrote out of her own experience, just to help women who maybe don't yet feel safe enough to come into a community. They don't want to be known to that level, face-to-face, kneecap to kneecap maybe, but here as an online resource, they can begin to hear truth and connect with other women in a virtual environment who have experienced betrayal trauma.
Well, and the other part of that is too, just if I'm telling on myself a little bit, when Trey's in my story kind of came out and I began to understand what he was struggling with, my whole thought process was, if I'll just go get him fixed, everything will be okay. And again, when we're talking about trauma and what a wife actually goes through, or a spouse or a partner goes through, as it relates to this trauma, this betrayal trauma, she has to do the work. So if the struggler goes off and gets all the work, or does all the work, finds the healing community, sometimes that can even compound the pain for the spouse, because he's done all these horrible things, and now he's found community. He's beginning to find healing and the support he needs and the counseling. And if she doesn't, if she's still staying in isolation and shame, and somehow this might be her fault, all the things that you think afterwards, then it's only going to compound a lot of her stuff. And so the goal is that the spouse or the struggler that is struggling with pornography, as well as the partner who's been betrayed, that both of them find healing community. And we have that community online, and we also have that community offline, so that wherever individuals are, they can get the healing that they need and also find the community.
So again, we're with an organization called Undone Redone. This is how you can connect with us on social media. We are a grateful partner to be a part of the coalition with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We love the work that Dawn and her team are just in the trenches,
Yes.
Day in and day out, encouraging all of us who are in this fight. So I just encourage you to get involved. I just applaud you for being a part of this WRAP week, the emphasis here on battling pornography. And just want you to understand that it cannot be done in isolation. So if you do have someone in your life who's struggling, and you're interested in maybe knowing more about how to get some healing community around that person, or more information about our Embark or other intensives around the country, we'd love to connect with you. Don't forget about the free resource at undoneredone.com/wrap. It may be, we were trying to put that up real quickly before the webinar, so if it's not immediately giving you a download, be patient, maybe come back to it. We'll have that working shortly if it's not working already. So thank y'all for tuning in. Again, this is Trey and Melody Lovern with Undone Redone, just thanking you for your time today. God bless.